I'm Neville Aitchison, and welcome to the Book Show. And welcome as well to my co-host, John Reynolds. How are you, John?
Good, thanks, Neville. Good to be here as always.
Well, we've got John, we've got World Book News, we've got our special guest, Terry Williams, and then we'll be answering your questions in the mailbag. But first up, John Reynolds. How are you?
Good.
And what have you got on the plate?
Well, some interesting books have come out recently. There's one that I particularly like called The Yellowbirds. The Yellowbirds by Kevin Powers. It's a novel about a young ex-soldier in Iraq and how he got on in Iraq, his feelings towards Iraq, his experiences in Iraq. It reminded me of some of the poets, the war poets of the First World War, Sassoon and Graves and Owen, who wrote some wonderful poetry.
Yes.
Though in their case, many of them wrote wonderful poems at the beginning of the war, saying how great this was. I think it was, one of them said, "Now God be thanked who brought us to this hour." And then, of course, 2 years later, in the filth of the trenches, their attitude somewhat changed. Very much so, yes.
Yeah. Well, they of course were poets who went to war.
Yes, they were indeed.
And so this young man is the same, or he's
he's
someone
a fictional character within the Yellowbird. So it's about a soldier, but he's not just going and fighting the war. He's thinking about it and writing about it and everything else. So, yes, the Yellowbirds, Kevin Powers. Then there was another one which there's 4 books now on Lyndon B. Johnson. How could I remember LBJ? Hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? We remember all those, the anti-war marches and so on and so forth. This is a book called The Passage of Power, which is the 4th volume of his life. It's written by Robert A. Caro, C-A-R-O. And it talks, and I'll just read what Robert Harris, who's a favourite author of mine, he wrote a couple of comments about this book, and he probably, I'm sure he says it much better than I do. 2 examples stand out, this is in the book. One is his account of John F. Kennedy's assassination as seen, or rather not seen, by Johnson, who had his head pressed to the floor of his limousine by a Secret Service agent, who was then literally dragged to a safe room in the Dallas hospital. A more riveting narrative than any fiction. And the other is the mutual loathing between LBJ and Robert F. Kennedy, which presumably will reach its full poisonous flowering in the 5th volume. Beautifully written, I thought. Yeah.
Full poisonous flowering.
Yes.
I love that.
Yes, yes. So that's Passage of Power, Robert O. Caro's book on LBJ. All Kiwis of our age would remember LBJ and the Vietnam War marches and all those sort of things. We lived right through that time, didn't we?
Yes.
Yes, indeed.
In fact, I can remember marches in Wellington, marches in Christchurch, was where I was positioned in those days.
Yes, and up Queen Street, I think it was 10,000 people marched in the anti-war mobilisation.
Yeah.
I mean, it was huge. Yes, so it's. I think there'll always be books about that. And this book of the Iraq War, you go back to that and you could say, well, LBJ and Vietnam was his downfall, and certainly people will always equate George W. Bush.
Yes.
He was even thicker than LBJ in my personal view, with the war in Iraq.
Yes.
And his little monkey friend that used to trot along behind him, what was his name? Tony Blair, wasn't it?
Tony Blair, yes indeed.
Yes, indeed.
And the thing I delight in is George W.'s wife, who said, "I'm the Bush that can pronounce nuclear." Yes.
Yes. So there's a couple from World Book News.
All right, lovely. All right, well, we'll be back with you shortly, John, but in the meantime, we're off to the break and then we're back with Terry Williams.
If the book you are reading late at night is not helping you sleep, maybe it's time for Sleep by Remy Fairman. This natural product helps you to have a normal and healthy sleep. It calms a racing mind and helps with anxiety. Suitable for men and women. Wake up refreshed and able to remember the story. Available from leading pharmacies and health stores. Is your get up and go gone? With age, our cardiovascular system tends to slow down, losing some of its efficiency along the way. If you want to live life to the max, then the natural cardiologist-approved product CardioMax is for you. It assists healthy and normal blood flow through the cardiovascular system without stressing the heart. For more information, call 0800 567 800 and ask about the CardioMax special deal.
Welcome back. Our next guest is Terry Williams. Terry's here to talk to us about his latest book, The Brain-Based Boss, but he's also the author of this wonderful advisory for teenagers and their parents, The Guide, How to Kiss, Get a Job, and other stuff you need to know. So Terry's a man who's challenged himself to become an author and a stand-up comedian. And it's a great pleasure to say a good evening to my special guest, Terry Williams. How are you?
Very well, thank you, Neville.
Okay, this is the book show, so we're talking about books, and you've written a couple.
Yes. Back in 2008, I wrote a guidebook for young people, life skills, told in a humorous and non-preachy way, called The Guide, How to Kiss, Get a Job, and Other Stuff You Need to Know.
Okay.
And more recently, completely differently, a book called The Brain-Based Boss, How to Increase Employee Engagement at Work and Tap into People's Internal Motivations.
First of all, let's get a wee look at who was Terry Williams.
Well, probably 13 years ago, I started this my thing. Whereas every year I would set myself a New Year's resolution of doing 2 new dangerous things a year. My kids were growing up, I was in a bit of a sameness job, senior management role, local government, telecommunications, same. I want to break out of this. And that first 2 dangerous things in that first year was snow skiing and stand-up comedy. And I had absolutely no background, I was never the class clown. But I thought, no, this will scare me, this will stretch me, this will push me through the comfort zone. And so I did it, and I did it again, killed my first night out, died on my bum, the second and third, got back on the horse and been doing it now for 13 years. So I guess I've been living, as you've noticed over this time, a bit of a double life, serious businessman by day, professional MC, comedian, speaker by night.
Yep.
And it got to a point probably about 2 days before the global economic crisis where I quit the day job.
Yep.
This is a bit of advice they always give you is never quit the day job. And I did it. I sold the house, set up my shop, and been writing and speaking and comedying ever since.
The Guide, How to Kiss, Get a Job, and Other Stuff You Need to Know. What was the germination of that?
Well, again, pretty much my own children. It's quite from a selfish perspective. That book's aimed at 15 to 25-year-olds.
Yep.
Setting them up for everything they could want to know before they get to my age, basically. From really rudimentary stuff, how to wash your clothes, how to cut your toenails, through to getting a flat, getting a job, office politics, relationships, through to some quite heavy stuff, death and drugs and depression.
Right.
All sourced from experts in one concise place, user-friendly, accessible style, tinged with humour throughout, some great cartoons in there that make a real point. And parents are buying it for their kids, leaving it lying around, it's getting discovered, it's in all the schools, it's in all the libraries. And in a little way, every day making the world just a little bit better place.
All right.
But primarily, selfish start.
Yeah.
My own kids have got it.
Nevertheless, it sort of reminds me about process. Do you do all of the research first and then just write, or do you write and research as you go along and edit yourself, as it were?
I go for bulk. I go for the shotgun approach first, and then I start narrowing down to a laser.
Yep.
So it's different to a degree because we had almost carte blanche the first time out from the publisher.
Yeah.
And their only constraint was that it be not preachy.
Yes.
Because they had another project lined up, loved it to bits, but just way too preachy. So we walked in 3 minutes later and pitched our idea saying, it's this, but it's not preachy.
Right.
Just total luck.
Yeah.
And so there was no constraints on the topics or the style, but as we amassed just so, what do you need to know in life?
Mm.
And once you discover something about drugs, that raises something about mental illness and all this other stuff. So, and then we start prioritising. Okay, well, what do you need to know, and what order do you need to know it?
Yeah.
And so we came up with kind of an onion model. So at the hub of it is yourself, and beyond that your family, beyond that your relationships, and beyond that the community you're in, and then the last layer of the onion is the big bad world.
Right.
And so that suddenly, once we had that model, all the content fell into place. So I guess to answer your question is I start wide, go through a process of discovery, and then come up with some simple models which the book hangs on, which if you remember nothing else, you'll take away those models. And that's certainly the case in The Brain-Based Boss.
All right. Well, good. Well, we'll come to that. Except I want to ask you, are we still doing the downhill skiing?
Not as often as I'd like,
right.
But I live to tell the tale, and my knees are fully intact, so I've got no problems with that.
All right, skiing, stand-up comedy. Stand-up comedies, it occurred to me, it's a bit about writing as well, really.
Well, by definition, you know, I mean, there's no one in New Zealand who's writing, who's telling anybody else's jokes, and that's the beauty of, and the hard part of being a comedian, or indeed anything else in New Zealand. If you're a plumber, you know, you start out, you do your own books, you paint your own wagon, and all the rest of it until you get enough capital to get someone else to do that. And that's definitely the case with a comedian. You start out as an amateur doing it for the love, the exposure, and the occasional free beer.
Yep.
Until suddenly you value what you do, and free milks and cow and all the rest of it.
All right.
And certainly in the time that I've been doing it, it's really professionalised now. For 8 years, I was secretary of the New Zealand Comedy Guild, which was our union. Yep. Which a union of comedians is a little bit like herding burning cats, but it's worked. Along with obviously some other things have happened in that time as well, with some international success and some other TV projects that have come along that have really created this pyramid and this career path, where it's not laughable that kids coming out of school, coming out of uni, can think, I can be a professional comedian and buy a house at some point, just like a plumber can.
The brain-based boss. So this is a fair way, I would have thought. Just the title says this is a fair way from the guide for teenagers and stand-up comedy to adding serious value through employee engagement.
Well, it's not a million miles away in its origin. I was emceeing the national awards, the series of national awards for the dairy industry. And as part of that, I got all their community, all their regional conveners together for a bit of a motivational session and spoke to them for an hour. And one of the dairy farmers from Northland, Murray Jameson, came up to me with a question about one of his staff, whose nickname was Sleepy. Well, that's always a good start.
Yes.
You know, I think, okay.
Yep.
And I couldn't answer his question. You know, how can you motivate someone whose nickname is Sleepy, who does just enough? They punch the clock, they consume oxygen, they perform. They punch the clock, they go home. And you can see the potential in there. He's not trying to be a slave driver. He's just simply trying to turn this guy on to be all he can be.
Yeah.
And Sleepy doesn't want to borrow it. And I didn't have an answer to his question, so he kind of put me on the spot. And I thought, So I started the research and looking into ended up being over 100 psychological studies and papers and books and so forth. But what do you do with someone who's got potential, but their fire has not yet been lit?
Right.
And suddenly I had all this research. I should do something with this. I should turn it into a training program because I do that. I should turn it into something online and say, I've written a book. Why wouldn't I write another book? And so it became a book.
So if I'm the head of a big corporation, or I'm a two-person plumber's shop, differences appeal to both?
I think the driving philosophy behind the book is individualisation and customisation. Everyone's different. So the initial approach is self-awareness. So we give you some tools to be, what is your style when it comes to motivation? Just 'cause, what works for you doesn't necessarily work for anybody else. And a lot of us, be they CEOs of large corporations or mom and pop operations, their philosophy is, treat others as you would like to be treated, which sounds great, but that's not true. One man's chocolate fish is a treat, and another man it's unnecessary calories.
Yeah.
And so it's all about be aware of your own drives and styles, and then to look for clues in the behaviour of others.
Right.
So it's all about observing behaviours. And it's not necessarily about doing surveys and ticking boxes because some consultant says you should. All this stuff you can do yourself. It's a bit harder, obviously, if you're a CEO of a company with hundreds of employees because you cannot physically be there. But you can tool up your second level, third tier leaders with those skills to do it themselves and just keep them on their toes.
So you'd say, if I asked you, you'd say this is the big blue pill and everybody should buy it. But is it aimed at some groups more than others, do you think?
Well, just to grab the blue pill thing, I think it's more like the pick and mix at the supermarket in a chemist shop, which has got lots of different kind of pills and you can choose whichever ones you want.
Right.
I think primarily it would be benefiting any kind of employer and anyone who's in a leadership role. And that's quite broad, so I think particularly those who are starting out. There's definitely some refresher value in there for those who are already genuinely successful in leadership roles. And I must admit, I meet some who say that about the book. Hey, it was a great refresher. And I know these people. I think, you might think you know this stuff, but are you actually applying it?
Yes.
So they might be lacking a little bit in the self-awareness department. But most of the feedback I'm getting from is frontline supervisors and those who are on their way up the ranks becoming that.
Right.
So it's really useful collection of studies, but it's not written as an academic tome or anything like that. There's a fair degree of humour throughout it as well.
I was going to say, you're listing the attributes it has before. It has some of that trademark Terry Williams humour and the light-hearted touch to make the point.
Exactly right, and that's exactly the point, Neville, is it's always to make the point. When I run a training program, I always tell them at the start, I confess that I'm also a comedian, and if you're worried that you're being trained by a clown in serious business topics, don't worry. Fun helps to reinforce the learning, but every time we do something even remotely humorous, there's always a serious reason behind it, and that's to reinforce the learning or to help make a point.
I think there's a lot in here that I can learn as well. And the thing I like is that it's something that I can keep going back to. Well, we'll have you back when you write your next book and you can tell us just how successful this is. Or maybe the world will have changed because everybody's following that advice.
That's fantastic. I hope so. Appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, Neville.
Thanks very much.
Cheers.
We'll be back right after the break talking with John Reynolds about what's on his mind, what's in the mailbag, what's happening in the world of books.
If the book you are reading late at night is not helping you sleep, maybe it's time for Sleep by Remy Fairman. This natural product helps you to have a normal and healthy sleep. It calms a racing mind and helps with anxiety. Suitable for men and women. Wake up refreshed and able to remember the story. Available from leading pharmacies and health stores. Is your get up and go gone? With age, our cardiovascular system tends to slow down, losing some of its efficiency along the way. If you want to live life to the max, then the natural cardiologist-approved product CardioMax is for you. It assists healthy and normal blood flow through the cardiovascular system without stressing the heart. For more information, call 0800 567 800 and ask about the CardioMax special deal.
Welcome back to the book show, and that was Terry Williams. Great, didn't it?
Oh, yes, indeed.
Okay.
I do like the title, particularly the second one, because so much of a book is encapsulated by its title. If you don't get the title right, people will just walk away.
Yes, and well, it's a couple of great titles, really. How to Kiss, Get a Job, and other stuff you need to know.
Yes, I think
I'm
that's
buying
very
that
good.
one.
Yes, yes.
Anyway, from stand-up comic to something a little more serious. So what are we talking about today?
We've got a book by Christopher Hitchens, and it's called Mortality.
Right.
And Christopher Hitchens, who's raconteur, author, critic, all sorts of things, he wrote mostly for Vanity Fair.
Yes.
Discovered he had cancer, who was born in Portsmouth, I think it was. And then he emigrated to the States, and he shifted backwards and forwards across the Atlantic for many years, became the friend and critic of statesmen and all sorts of people.
In fact, I remember him more as a columnist than as a
Yes.
Novelist,
Yes.
shall we say? Yeah.
Yes, very much
The
so.
Times Literary Review, I think.
That yes.
And very
Indeed.
acerbic.
Oh, very acerbic. He didn't suffer fools gladly. You read his writing, you go, ooh, I'm glad he's not talking about me.
Anyway, Mortality.
Well, Mortality, his first book was called Hitch 22, a play on Catch 22, which was a very detailed but very readable autobiography about his life and his passions and everything else, and justifying the fact that though he was beloved of the left wing and was, as we said earlier on the program, a lot of us were against the war in Vietnam, and he certainly was, he came out a fierce advocate of the war in Iraq,
Right.
which shocked a lot of the left. And he used his pen to metaphorically support the war in Iraq and George Bush and Tony Blair.
Yes.
And he talks about that in his
So,
new
in
book.
fact, he was openly accused of being a neoconservative. I
Oh,
think.
he was.
Yeah.
Absolutely. He'd shifted completely.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. Then he discovered he had cancer. He had a lifestyle that almost, you could almost say it was going to come. He drank heavily, he smoked to excess, and he admits it. And then, I'm sorry,
I found
Neville.
something
Yes.
to like about
Yeah,
it.
absolutely. So he wrote, and I love the cover of this book, perhaps because it's very different from this vibrant guy with plenty of hair. Here's this, it's almost a painting of this man suffering from cancer. And he wrote about it, rather than crawling into a hole and saying, why has this happened to me? He takes us on his journey through cancer and how he felt and the pain and so on and so forth. He was a strong atheist, and he was often attacked by Christians, or Christians would come and try and talk to him, to try and convert him. When he got cancer, some of them circled round him, saying, now you've got cancer, repent, we'll get you through the pearly gates. Not at all. And now a lot of people undergo a sort of Damascus Road experience, but not him.
Right. So this is a grim story?
Well, it is, yes. But on the other hand, there's the fact that he's writing about it and talking about it frankly, I think is a lesson to all of us who are, can't run around the block as fast as we used to. Yeah. Richard Dawkins, the famous scientist, he writes about this book. He says, Christopher Hitchens, finest orator of our time, fellow horseman, valiant fighter against all tyrants, including God. I thought that would be typical Dawkins.
Yes.
I'll read you a couple of excerpts because it's well
lovely.
worth.
I was just looking at the cover there.
Yes.
He looks remarkably like Van Gogh.
Yes, yes, the style.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's a painting or if it's a photograph that has been then doctored to make it look like a painting, but it is very good. This was the introduction to the book. There's just a little introduction by a friend of his called Graydon Carter. For the fact is that Christopher was one of life's singular characters, a wit, a charmer, a troublemaker, and a dear devoted friend. He was a man of insatiable appetites, there you go, for cigarettes, for scotch, for company, for great writing, and above all for conversation. That he had an output to equal what he took in was the miracle in the man. You'd be hard-pressed to find a writer who could match the outpouring of exquisitely crafted columns, essays, articles, and books he produced over the past 4 decades. Christopher wrote fast, frequently, without the benefit of a second draft or even corrections. I could be so lucky. Perhaps in the back of his mind, he knew that the time on the stage would end in the second act, and he was racing to get it all in, to get it all out, once he discovered he had cancer. I can recall a lunch in 1991 when he was editing the New York Observer, and he and Amy and I got together for a quick bite at a restaurant on Madison, no longer there. Christopher's copy was due early that afternoon. Pre-lunch tumblers of scotch were followed by a couple of glasses of wine during the meal, and then a couple of post-meal cognacs. That was his mistake. After stumbling back to the office, he set up a rickety table and an old Olivetti, and in a symphony of clacking, he produced a 1,000-word column of near perfection in under half an hour. That's absolutely remarkable.
It is indeed.
For those of us who slave.
Well, I wish I could do it. I've got a 1,000-word column due yesterday. And
okay.
I can feel the editor beaming down on me at the moment.
So, tumbler of scotch, couple of wines, and a cognac afterwards, and you'll be away.
Yes. I'd be forgetting that I even had an editor.
Yes.
Yeah.
Here's a more, perhaps he's thinking more reflectively about what's actually happening to him. I have more than once in my time woken up feeling like death, but nothing prepared me for the early morning in June when I came to a conscious feeling that as if I was actually shackled to my own corpse. The whole cave of my chest and thorax seems to have been hollowed out and then refilled with slow drying cement. I could hardly hear myself breathe and could not manage to inflate my lungs. My heart was beating either too much or too little. Any movement, however slight, required foresight and forethought and planning. So that's his description of when he first discovered he had cancer. But even then, he writes, my thorax seemed to have been hollowed out and refilled with slow drying cement. So he brings his literary skills to that incident in his life, which set the whole thing in train.
Yes.
And that's what makes it a very interesting book, a very readable book, even though you're going, oh, poor guy, oh, how dreadful.
Yes, but it's the craft and the style.
It's the craft and the style.
And in fact, I recall reading Times literary reviews and about books I will never read and don't even know, but the essays themselves are worth reading. Yes.
Yeah, they are indeed. Perhaps just a fine little piece here, because again he writes with a certain black humour. Not many weeks ago, I started a bedridden day in a state of acute powerlessness and quite rough pain. As I lay unable to move, but braced from past experience, I heard a soothing, capable voice saying, "Now you might feel just a little prick." be assured, male patients have exhausted all the possibilities of this feeble joke within the first few days of hearing it. I mean, that's just so Hitchings-like.
Yes, it
is. Just so Hitchings-like. Yeah,
indeed. So this is worth the effort.
Oh, worth the effort, because it's not very big. Not that that should define the book, but you can. It's a book I've gone back and dipped into it from time to time, and it's a book that you could read even if you're fit and healthy, like both of us, Neville.
Yes.
Yes. Or perhaps
slightly circumferentially challenged.
Indeed. Yes. And in my case, follically challenged as well. Yes. Yeah. And it's a book that if you, perhaps even if you were in hospital or if you'd had some nasty disease or something like that, it would be something to read, because here's a very intelligent, erudite man who's facing this and facing it on the basis I can't do anything about it. I'll write about it.
But I'll write about it.
I'll write about it.
Indeed.
And I guess for him it was almost cathartic to write about it, to get his thoughts down on paper.
Yes.
And so well. So Mortality, Christopher Hitchens.
All right. Excellent. Well, thank you, John, once again. All right. You'll be back next week.
I shall see you next week, indeed.
Indeed. We'll be diving into the world of books once again. You'll bring along the little bag. Out will come the goodies, and we'll have a natter about that.
Indeed. Look forward to that.
All right. Thank you. And thank you, folks, for being here. I'm Neville Aitchison. That's it from the book show tonight. We'll see you next week. In the meantime, good reading.